It's likely you've heard the phrase dancing in the rain, but what about singing while on fire? But literally singing while literally on fire. Well, one Georgian man, he did just that. On March 18th, 1991, as the river flowed and the wind was felt rolling over the hills of the gorge, he sang a simple song as he turned to ashes in the faces of his enemies. With this last hurrah, he joined a long list of warriors during a time where freedom or control came at the price of souls. This event left an indelible mark on both his captors and his community. One side was haunted while the other knew he was built for this. But was it truly worth it? This is the story of Merab Mindiashvili. By this time, Georgia, the country, had been a part of the USSR or Soviet Union for 70 years. And although it existed under this banner, many Georgians didn't lose their sense of a distinct identity. Religion, lineage, their language, it all still mattered to them. And this was in spite of the aggressive and often bloody, oppressive actions that the Union took against them and the other countries in the Union to eliminate a sense of national consciousness. They wanted people to have a homogenous Soviet identity. But by the late 80s, the tides were turning, and quickly. And with this change, conflicts increased. One notable event was the April 9th tragedy, also known as the Tbilisi Massacre or Tbilisi Tragedy. It was on April 9th, 1989 that Soviet troops killed 21 protesters, mostly women, and injured hundreds of others in Tbilisi, which is the capital of Georgia. What was a peaceful anti-Soviet protest turned into a horror scene. The protesters were led by the Independence Committee in response to a number of different factors. But overall, the fight was for an independent Georgia, free from Soviet control. One of the committee leaders was Zviad Gamsakhudia. Remember him, okay? And this date, because they play a role in Merab's story. But this fight for an independent state clearly entailed that clear geographic boundaries needed to be understood. A country can only claim but so much real estate on earth. But Georgia was not ethnically uniform, and thus we have a problem. Inside Georgian territory were two major autonomous regions. There was a third, but we're not getting into that. They had their own distinct identity separate from Georgians. They were not fully Soviet, but they weren't fully Georgian either. The history and relationships of these groups gets really complicated and really nuanced, and we're not going there. This story focuses on the autonomous region of South Ossetia. South Ossetians largely viewed themselves as closer culturally to the North Ossetians, who were in Russia's territory, than with the Georgians in the valley below. However, Georgians, Russians, Ossetians, and other ethnic groups occupied the land. But as long as the Soviet Union was intact, the Ossetians need not worry about Georgia fully incorporating them into one national identity. But as we know, the USSR was disintegrating, and quickly. So for many Ossetians, the nationalistic rhetoric and energy that was brewing for Georgia likely looked threatening to them. What would become of them and their identity if Georgia became independent and was thought of as only for the Georgians? Some viewed their response as survival, while others as separatism or a manipulation by Moscow or betrayal at the most critical moment on which freedom hinged. Thus, they found themselves in a war within a war. Each side viewed itself as defensive and the other as aggressive. Fear hardened into certainty. Neighbor turned against neighbor. Villages burned, people died, and others disappeared. It wasn't clean, and there were no clear front lines. This war consisted of neighborhood militias, family ties, and emerging leaders. Weapons were accrued through black markets and controlled depending on whoever could enforce it that day. It was personal. This is the fight Merab Mindiashvili found himself in. On January 14th, 1957, Merab was well acquainted with what each side wanted and was fighting for, and he knew where he stood on the matter. As harassment, hate, and violence grew between the Ossetians and Georgians, Merab took the role of a fighter. He returned from working as a driver in Russia in 1989 just as tensions were heating up. It was known that Ossetian separatists said they would, for example, boil Georgians that they captured alive. However, there were Georgians who spewed the same treacherous rhetoric right back at the Ossetian separatists. The entire situation was incredibly barbaric, but Merab was unfazed by these threats and promises. People who knew him reported that he was fearless and instilled a sense of security in his community by his presence alone. He did things that would give one legitimate reason to be cautious of him. The Ossetians and Russians alike feared him, so much so that he was spoken of with elements of legend, and his death in particular would be celebrated. To give the Georgians that were living in the area a chance to defend themselves, Merab began distributing weapons to the families in the Didi Liakvi Gorge region. This enabled them to resist aggressive Ossetian separatists and preserve the gorge for a while. And actually, 3 weeks before he was killed, 9 villages in that region actually elected him to be their leader, and lead he did. But on March 18th, Merab and his brother-in-law, Zurab Kabareli, were traveling down a Redvi road to meet, wait for it, with Zviad Gamsakuria. Ossetian separatists gained knowledge of their whereabouts from other Georgians, allegedly including Goga Kainjava, a rival of Zviad, and they knew exactly where to intercept them on that fateful day. And of course, Merab didn't have his weapon at the time. Had he, this story may have gone a different way, but we'll never know. In those early morning hours in the gorge, Merab and Zurab probably talked, maybe joked, who knows. But in one moment, a gun was aimed. In the next, a bullet ripped through Zurab, killing him on the spot. The fire kept coming as Merab jumped out from behind the wheel of the car they were in, took a few steps, and turned to help his brother-in-law, who had already passed, when a bullet ripped through his stomach and he was taken captive. The separatists tied him to a tree in the gorge and, making good on their threats, set him on fire. They had caught the feared Georgian in the region. But while being burnt alive, Merab did something that would etch itself into the memories of his captives for years to come, and elevated his status to that of a legendary fighter and hero for Georgia. He sang Shavlego. This story is about a warrior from Georgia's history who wore a black traditional choka, which ended up being painted red from soaking in the blood of foreign enemies. This song became a unifying tune that embodied the fighting spirit associated with the Georgians for thousands of years. And it's not far-fetched to understand why Merab's captors would be unsettled by that experience, to say the least. Later that morning, Merab's people, including his childhood friend and fellow fighter, Nugzar Kaulishvili, found his charred body after having seen smoke rising in the area earlier that morning. And Merab's wife was actually pregnant at the time with their 4th child, a daughter. Nugzar reported that his friend was buried 3 days later, and the flow of mourners did not cease. Merab was loved and respected by many. According to those who knew him, what Merab cared about was the truth and pursuing it. And although the pain did not cease, Merab was actually celebrated as a hero even to this day. Conversely, in celebration of their kill, the separatists actually set off fireworks in the capital of South Ossetia, the name which I just struggle to say. I think it's Skinfali. I can't say the letters. But despite this celebration, Merab's actions left his captors bewildered, unable to comprehend where his strength came from. During my research, I actually found out that his death was filmed, but I couldn't find the video. And honestly, I don't think I would watch it, even if I were able to. But not only was it filmed, but a Georgian allegedly took the video, showed it, and used it as proof that the Georgians were setting Ossetians on fire, although Merab's situation was literally the exact opposite. This sense of a betrayal went deep, and a quick Google search will let you know that the person who allegedly did this is not viewed all that positively by a number of vocal Georgians. But at this time, I have not done extensive research on this person, therefore I will refrain from attaching his name to this particular event. This story is about Merab. Less than 2 weeks after he was killed, over 98% of voters in Georgia chose a free independent nation. The formal declaration took place on April 9th, 1991, exactly 2 years after the Tbilisi massacre. And remember Zviad? Well, he was elected the first president of the now independent Georgia in May of that year. And furthermore, the USSR, Soviet Union, collapsed December 26, 1991, just 9 months after Merab's death. Georgia and the larger Caucasus is an often overlooked region, yet they are rich in history, nuance, and strategic importance. This wouldn't be the end of the conflicts or bloodshed for these groups mentioned in the story. Identity, freedom, right, wrong, loyalty, betrayal, life and death, these people know it all. Today, South Ossetia exists as an autonomous region in Georgia under Russian control. They're considered Russian-occupied territory by Georgia and the larger part of the world, but as an independent republic by themselves, and Russia and literally just a few other places in the UN. And 2 of those places actually recognized it and then retracted their recognition. So there's that. It's very convoluted. Additionally, Georgia is actually experiencing a political crisis internally right now. There's concern that the Georgian Dream Party, which is in control right now, is pushing Russian-style law and moving against democratic and Western integration that it was once moving toward and was actually the pride of Eurasia at the time the Soviet Union fell. And to top it all off, there are concerned murmurs brewing as what they will do or what's going to happen if Russia concludes their war with Ukraine and turns its attention back to Georgia. Merab Mindiashvili represents the indomitable spirit found throughout Georgia's history. People will have different views on how everything went down, and there are elements that we may never know. What remains is a story of both tragedy and celebration, a story that means something to everyone involved.